Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Just Infrastructure Speaker Series. My name is Kiri Karahalios, and along with Anita Chan and Indy Gupta, my fellow co-leads of the Just Infrastructures Initiative, we will be your host for today's event.
For those of you who don't know us yet, Just Infrastructures is an initiative created by researchers to interrogate the complex interactions between people, algorithms, and AI-driven systems. You can learn more about us and see more information about our next event with Ranveer Chandra on March 31st at our website at just-infras.illinois.edu. A link has been added to the chat. You can see our full spring calendar of talks there too.
We would like to thank our funders and sponsors, the Computer Science Department, the School of Information Sciences, the Granger College of Engineering's SRI program, Capital One, and the Community Data Clinic for supporting this programming. We also have a long list of non-financial co-sponsors you can see on our website, and we would like to thank them as well.
To ask a question, please use the Q&A box. We'll go through the questions at the end of the talk. Closed captioning and American Sign Language support is also available. Please use the chat to request any tech support, and a note that this talk is being recorded.
Land acknowledgement. I'd like to now ask you to join me in a land acknowledgement. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists and the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose lands it is located.
We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Weah, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Acknowledgements invite us to ask, what does it mean to live in a post and neo-colonial world? What did it take for us to get here? And how can we be accountable to our part in history?
We'd now like to turn it over to our esteemed presenter. We are extremely honored to have Dr. Nathan Matias with us here today. Nathan Matias is an assistant professor at the Cornell University Department of Communication. He is also the founder of the Citizens and Technology Lab, formerly civil servant, a public interest research group at Cornell that organizes citizen behavioral science and behavioral consumer protection research for digital life. Cat Lab has worked with communities of tens of millions of people on social media platforms to test ideas for preventing harassment, broadening gender diversity on social media, responding to human algorithmic misinformation, managing political conflict, and auditing social technologies. His work organizes citizen behavioral science for a safer, fairer, and more understanding internet. Nathan, thank you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. So I want to take us back to the before times in 2014. After someone illegally broke into multiple celebrity photo accounts, people posted non-consensual intimate imagery to forums on the platform Reddit. And as people downloaded and reacted to these photos, Reddit's popularity algorithms promoted them to even more people who kept the cycle going and even donated money to the company in appreciation, earning Reddit more than $100,000 before the company eventually banned the content a week later. This incident, like so many problems with the internet, was a complicated mess. Reddit, a company, built a system that profited off what people found popular, using algorithms that observed and amplified those interests. And communities organized around misogyny and disregard for women, people who had violated people's privacy for lurid pleasure, and with the help of the algorithm, distributed this harm widely. In an article on toxic technocultures, Adrian Massanari describes how non-human technological agents can shape and are shaped by human activity. During this dreadful episode, a set of powerful non-human technological agents, including Reddit's business model, its corporate policies, and its popularity algorithms, were driving and being influenced by a large group of people in cultures with dehumanizing views of women, encouraged by the many thousands of others who viewed and spread this material without consent. As I said, people who donated to Reddit to signal their appreciation for the systems that made it possible. This case of an interaction between this algorithm and a very broken culture. Now, the problem of interrelated human and machine behavior is a deep and pervasive one. These feedback loops have been blamed for mass murder, for self-harm and suicide, and health misinformation, just to name a few. But even as we worry about the risks, society has also seen beautiful examples of humans and machines that cooperate to spread generosity, to grow human understanding, and to develop transformative citizen power. There are people who are alive and healthy today and who live in a hope of a more just society thanks to the benefits of these feedback loops between humans and machines that are also capable of tremendous harm. Today, I want to ask how we can govern human and machine behavior. And as a social scientist and as a computer scientist, I also want to ask how we can do that in a democracy. At Cornell, I lead the Citizens and Technology Lab, who work alongside the public in citizen science to inform how we govern. We work together to test the social impacts of digital power and discover effective ideas for change. The best projects at Cat Lab achieve a trifecta of direct value to the public, scholarly knowledge, and policy impacts. And our approach to developing knowledge is inspired by what social psychologists Betsy Pollack, Robert Cialdini, and others call full cycle research. My version, which I call citizen behavioral science, looks like this. We often start by having conversations with communities about issues that matter to them. We then carry out observational analyses of online behavior with their permission and collaboration. We follow up with further participatory research design that then leads to field experiments and engages with theory, often but not exclusively in communication and social psychology and computer science at times. We work towards a larger vision where digital power is both guided by evidence, a future where that's true and where that power is accountable to the public. And today I want to invite you into that vision, a world where we can reduce harm and move toward more flourishing societies through a combination of evidence-making, collective action, and the ongoing struggle of governance. I also want to inspire you to make your own discoveries that could help humans live better in a world of algorithms. And I should acknowledge the many people whose work and ideas come together in what I'm presenting today. The many community partners of Cat Lab and the students and staff and collaborators I've had over the years. As we ask this question about governing human and machine behavior, you might be asking it as a member of the public worried about the role of technology in your life. You might be an activist, a tech employee, or a policymaker. And whoever you are, you're still asking a set of basic questions. What does it mean to govern? What knowledge do we need to govern well? How do we create that knowledge? And how can knowledge inform governance? Answering these questions is one of the grand challenges of our time. And I hope you come away from today's talk with an appetite to join what Elinor Ostrom called the struggle to govern. Let's start here. What does it mean to govern? According to social scientists who study these things, policy is often described in terms of putting out fires, especially if more of those fires keep on happening, and it seems like a repeatable approach to fighting them would be useful. Governance begins when someone identifies a problem, people debate the problem, people propose solutions, and then people talk about ways to evaluate those policy solutions. At the end of that exhausting process, institutions may or may not do anything, but hey, that's the world of policy. And our first challenge when governing human and machine behavior is to identify who is in a position to govern. For example, when an algorithm interacts with humans to promote misinformation, who is responsible and who can create change? Is it governments, tech companies, public institutions like news publishers, members of the public who are engaged in sharing this content or working to debunk it? Or is the problem capitalism itself? Let's start with government. While the US and many other countries don't yet have algorithm governance agencies, we do have agencies dedicated to governing other complex systems, including aviation, cars, food, our workplaces, air quality, poverty, medicine, education, housing, elections, national security. We have lots of agencies that engage in this kind of governance work, and many of those already have some role in governing what we do online. Tech companies also have a role. In Custodians of the Internet, Charlton Gillespie points out that governance is one of the core offerings of any tech platform. They are, by definition, the institution that defines what behavior is possible, creates policies to encourage or discourage certain behaviors, generates revenue on the basis of how well their policies work. You'll recall that Disney chose not to acquire Twitter because of their harassment problem. And then, of course, in the years since the scandal over non-consensual image sharing on Reddit, we've seen companies reluctantly embrace this reality, creating vast teams of content moderators in some cases, and whole offices of policymakers who routinely speak with legislatures, activists around the world in the desperate attempt to manage these policy problems and also protect companies' revenue by preventing government regulation. Public institutions also have a role, like consumer protection and journalistic organizations, who carry out governance kind of by proxy. When a journalist at the Markup or Consumer Reports discovers a problem with a technology, the publicity they generate that can put pressure on the company and force the company to acknowledge the problem and at least promise change. And in the scientific literature, though there's more research to be done, it does suggest that more often than not, scandals can influence corporate behavior if they can influence stock prices, harm a CEO's reputation with their friends, or invoke the risk of regulation. There's this great article from last year by Bozetta about how design happens forced through scandal. And another view promoted by Zuboff is that capitalism itself is a kind of force in the world, and that the very idea that you could or should govern human and machine behavior online is an alarming and parasitic, to quote Zuboff, threat to human freedom and democracy. She writes, instead of armaments and armies, capitalism works its will through the automated medium of an increasingly ubiquitous computational architecture. Now, even as people with fancy titles debate how to govern human and machine behavior, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people around the world are already doing governance work. Every time we support a friend online, create rules for our online group, resolve disputes, or even try to trick algorithms into working less badly for our communities. We see a problem, we discuss solutions, and we put them into practice. It's policy. Ever since the very earliest online spaces, platforms have been designed to run on volunteer leadership and intervention. And given that people volunteer for hours a day to create, manage, and enforce policies for millions of people online, we need to acknowledge this work as governance too. For example, moderators on Facebook, WhatsApp, Reddit, Wikipedia, and other platforms have tremendous power within their communities. They have access to unique actions within a platform. They have substantial powers to configure the design of their social spaces, from the visual style to the parameters even behind some algorithms. And they can carry out their work through default settings, coordination, automated systems, and appeals to a company. Now, over the last 6 years, I've been doing ethnographic fieldwork with Reddit moderators and Twitter harassment reporters to understand the nature of this governance work, how people organize, and how they relate to companies and to governments. I won't have time today to go into detail on that, but you can follow these links to learn more. In 2016, I was approached by some of these volunteers, moderators of the World News subreddit community on Reddit, a group of at the time, over 14 million subscribers who organized to share news about parts of the world outside the US. 4 years later, the group now has 26 million subscribers. This community uses the Reddit platform, but like all subreddit communities, is independent from the company. At the time, their international team of over 70 volunteer moderators created their own policies and had carried out enforcement for many years. And the community came to me with this policy problem, the problem of misinformation amplified by algorithms. Here, for example, is a story that someone posted to the community in January 2017. Almost everything about these headlines was wrong. The man was a Spanish national with a mental illness who was speaking in Catalan, not Arabic. They got the politics wrong, they got the details wrong, and none of these papers retracted or altered their articles. The world news community receives dozens of articles like this every day, and some of them were so popular that Reddit's algorithms were promoting them to even more people. There's a valuable business model which sustains these tabloids. People want it, and just like these businesses are supporting this misinformation, so is Reddit's algorithm. And managing this problem was taking a lot of work. The community also had an idea for a policy solution, something they thought might help. Can we encourage people to question news from inaccurate sources, they asked. They also had some uncertainty. What if their policy solution had an unintended side effect of causing Reddit's algorithms to promote that news even further? Although the community understood the problem, could imagine policies, and could debate the values behind those policies, they wanted to know the outcome of their idea to decide if they should do it. Like any institution trying to govern wisely and effectively, the world news community needed knowledge. So what do we know about the effects of encouraging people to question inaccurate source of information? Scholars who've studied misinformation by trying to correct it have looked at several different kinds of levels. Some have looked at how people develop and change their beliefs. Others study the social structures that shape the spread of information and what people end up believing. And online, these perceptions, beliefs, and social structures are all shaped and interrelated with the actions of algorithms. If you looked at your phone today, you probably encountered a news recommender. These algorithms observe the behavior of hundreds of millions of people and suggest to us what to read. These lists are delivered to our email inbox. They're in the background of sites like Facebook, or in the case of Reddit, they're the core product. During the last representative survey, roughly 6% of Americans read Reddit to get, quote, the front page of the internet, collated from the online behavior of hundreds of millions of people. Managing misinformation requires more than influencing people. It now involves understanding and influencing algorithms. So how do we do that? Computer scientists often focus on direct influence. The software engineers who create the algorithm, the data standard creators who define what it's able to know, the training data sets that sometimes steer a system's early actions. Many algorithms are also designed to be indirectly influenced, since their function is to observe human behavior and react accordingly. Here's how a news aggregator works, in theory at least. First, someone posts a news link. Then people react to that link in ways that are recorded by the platform. They might click, vote, or discuss the link. And then that information is observed by the news aggregator, whose design we can't know for sure because the company keeps the algorithm mostly secret. And then on the basis of what it observes, the algorithm decides whether to promote or demote the article. Now, of course, if it promotes the article, then more people will see it, respond to it. Aggregators can create runaway behavioral patterns called self-fulfilling prophecies. In a controlled experiment, Salganik and Watts found that in the case of music, if you actually invert the order of the recommendations to show lower quality songs at the top, those low quality songs can become more popular over time. And in a field experiment on Reddit, researchers found that simply applying a one upvote to an article on Reddit could cause this positive herding effect. And in the case of popular but inaccurate information, these online feedback loops are a serious problem. So how do we actually study these things? In lab and field experiments, researchers in human-computer interaction often look at the effects of algorithm decisions on human behavior, like how much are people influenced by the algorithm. Now, computer scientists often examine things that engineers can do, something that researchers of algorithmic accountability also study. Ethnographers like Masanari can observe how people and algorithms interact and come up with new ways to see what's happening in social contexts. But in my conversation with the moderators of the world news community, I realized we needed a very different kind of knowledge. They had this question about cause and effect. They wanted to know what would happen if they intervened to try to create some kind of change. So here's a way of understanding what their concern was. They were worried that nudging people to engage in fact-checking could backfire somehow. If someone posted inaccurate news and the community suggested volunteer fact-checking, what would happen if people actually went ahead and fact-checked them? As you've already seen, receiving one upvote on an article could cause it to cascade and have this herding effect. So what would happen if the news aggregator noticed this fact-checking behavior and interpreted skepticism as popularity and subsequently promoted inaccurate news? Basically, the community was wondering about something that engineers and behavioral scientists hadn't considered, that since human behavior influences algorithm behavior, attempts to influence human behavior might also go on to influence algorithms. So to test this idea, I designed experiment software that would respond whenever someone posted a new tabloid article to the community. In a control group, the software made no suggestions. In a treatment group, the software suggested fact-checking. And in a third group, the software encouraged people to fact-check and also use the voting function. The fact-checking condition encouraged people to improve this thread by linking to media that verifies or questions this article's claims. And the fact-checking and voting condition urged, if you can't independently verify these claims, please consider downvoting. I then used my software to observe two outcomes. The first was whether comments included links to further evidence, as we asked, excluding internal links to Reddit and image hosting sites. I also observed the rank position of an article over time in the recommender system. Here's what that looks like. Every 4 minutes for the first 7 hours after an article was posted, the software made a measurement of just where in the rankings an article was. And in this chart, 300 is the highest, very top of the rankings, whereas 0 indicates that the article is no longer in the top 300. The software also observed whether the article was removed by the moderators for violating community policies or being a duplicate. When that happens, the article is immediately pulled from the rankings, as you can see in the kind of black bar at 0 in this chart. And we had several hypotheses. The first was that if we encouraged fact-checking, people would actually link to further evidence. The second was that we thought that encouraging fact-checking might backfire, that it might increase the rank position of news articles from these regularly inaccurate news sources. And our third hypothesis was that encouraging fact-checking and voting might counteract that. And you can see our experiment pre-registration at that link. So from December 2016 to February 15 in 2017, participants made over 35,000 comments in 1,104 discussions of articles from labeled sources. Only a small percentage of the news they discussed overall. In a typical thread, people would actually respond with links to other sources and then go on to discuss which ones they trusted the most when prompted. And we see that in the results of our analyses as well. Using a number of statistical techniques, I found that, as expected, encouraging fact-checking does increase the percentage of comments that include links to other evidence, on average in world news. So that's part one. Are we influencing human behavior? Yes. So how do we find out if we're influencing algorithm behavior as well? To do this, I created a model for the average treatment effect of the intervention on the ranking of an article at a moment in time. Each regression model tested the effect at each 4-minute interval going through the first 7 hours. And the model was a straightforward linear regression predicting the article rank position at time t. And I posted a preprint if you want to dive into more of the statistical details. So in this chart, I plotted the result of each regression model and their confidence intervals, adjusted for multiple comparisons. So the dark orange line is the estimate, and the lighter orange bands are the confidence intervals. And we see that an article that received an encouragement towards fact-checking was actually demoted in the rankings by up to 24 rank positions on average, compared to the control group, enough actually to move it off the community's front page. What was the effect from encouraging fact-checking and voting? No discernible effect, though it might have just been smaller and not observable with our sample size. So this is good news for the community. Encouraging people to fact-check articles influences them to do fact-checking and could also reduce the spread of articles from unreliable sources by algorithms too. Based on this knowledge, the community could make a clear policy decision that effectively governed both human and machine behavior. Now, how does this study potentially add to science? As Robert Cialdini has written, field experiments help identify consequential phenomena in the world that further research can investigate in the field or in the lab. By confirming this potential to nudge algorithms, this study identifies such a phenomenon. We might also see similar algorithm nudges elsewhere. If a nudge influences people's retirement savings, it might also influence credit score algorithms. Or if a nudge influences people's prejudice, it might also influence discrimination by an algorithm that learns from prejudiced people. But there's a problem. Robert Kitchen and others have written about the challenge of making scientific discoveries or any kind of reusable knowledge about algorithm behavior. They're frequently written by their creators. Their behavior is contingent on changing surroundings. So can we make any general discoveries about human and machine behavior? This is one of the central questions I'm interested in, and I think this study may represent a small step. So how do we create that kind of knowledge? This is a picture from Robert Boyle's new experiments in 1606, which established the norm that scientists seek repeatable knowledge, developing testable hypotheses that are validated through reproduction and demonstration. And this kind of generalizable knowledge, if it can be obtained, is also pragmatically valuable. If we can describe, predict, and reliably change the behavior of humans and algorithms, we might be able to govern our complex world more effectively. But maybe algorithm behavior isn't a science. Since they're contingent on these changing surroundings and variations in human society and behavior, once you put them into what the pragmatist philosopher and psychologist William James called the rich, thicket of reality, maybe all bets are off. In this view, even though algorithms are very precisely defined by their creators, it's unlikely that we will be able to derive general knowledge about how they behave. And you often hear this refrain from tech leaders who say, we built this system, but we couldn't have anticipated how it would create harm. It's this view that it's not easy or possible to predict the behavior of a complex human-machine interaction. But maybe that's a good thing. Last year, Sendil Mullainathan argued that if algorithm behavior is more easily changed than human behavior, biased algorithms are easier to fix than biased people. You might spend a decade trying to resolve a discrimination problem in a human institution, but in theory, you can reprogram a computer to stop engaging in discrimination. The moment you change the algorithm, past knowledge about its performance becomes obsolete, and you have a fresh start on getting things right. That's maybe good for society, hard for those of us who are trying to actually come up with reliable knowledge about what those things are doing. Mullainathan's argument is in line with one tradition in computer science that strongly rejects the idea that CS is a scientific field. To quote Hornbeck and colleagues, computer scientists often think that if you can get something to work once, then you've succeeded. Rather than valuing replicable knowledge, there's a culture that values novelty. Now, this disinterest for replication, while far from universal in CS, is also very compatible with a culture that strongly values secrecy. Many computer scientists want to publish research without having to release the underlying source code or other essential resources for replication, transparency, or accountability. To understand why this question matters to governance, let's look at one of my favorite machines of all time. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to look at this picture and try to guess what this machine does. Can you tell? This is a SOC testing machine used by Consumer Reports, a members organization founded in 1936 that continues to do testing, journalism, and advocacy for consumer protection. The SOC tester applied consistent amounts of friction to large numbers of SOCs to find out which ones were the most durable. For those of you who do algorithm accountability and transparency, this was a SOC accountability and transparency system. Now let's ask ourselves, is knowledge about human SOC interaction repeatable? If I test a random sample of SOCs with this machine, will I be able to predict the reliability of future SOCs that I encounter? Or will I have to test every single SOC on the market to give you assurances about SOC reliability? Consumer Reports was founded because no one had yet derived precise enough generalizable knowledge about SOCs or the other products they were testing. So when new models of SOCs or cars or other products came out, Consumer Reports had to test every single one. This is exactly the same question facing the world news community. If it's possible to derive some general principles about human and algorithm behavior, then algorithmic policy would look something like economists at least imagine economic policy looks like. We could derive general principles, build policies around them, and update those policies from time to time as old theories are overturned and new theories arise. But if all prior knowledge is invalidated every time an engineer makes a change, we need to govern algorithms like we govern SOCs and other created artifacts. We need to design tests and standards, somehow get every algorithm in the world tested, and do it at a scale that matches the pace of innovation, or, as we do with medicines, slow down the pace of innovation to the pace of testing. So what's the answer? I'm actually not sure. There's a good case to be made for the predictability of human-algorithm interaction, and I hope the study I just shared becomes one of many others to help understand and govern more wisely. Algorithms are produced and trained by human processes, and people in tech firms in policy contexts are operating in certain business model circumstances, and we have multiple disciplines that produce knowledge about those processes. Algorithm design is constrained by mathematics, physics, and how computer scientists think. The influence of algorithms on individual behavior is already studied systematically. And finally, algorithms shape and are shaped by institutional and societal patterns like discrimination, misogyny, that have proven very resistant to many people's best efforts to create change. But maybe at the end of the day, powerful algorithms are more like SOCs than scientists. Philosophers and historians of science have argued that progress in science is often achieved through innovations in research methods. Just like Boyle, we need to invent research systems that enable us to ask questions in policy evaluation that previous researchers couldn't know to ask. And just like Consumer Reports in the 1930s, we need to develop research methods that are independent from industry, especially a technology industry that has a history of resisting accountability and co-opting academics to deflect criticism. At CatLab, we develop innovative community organizing processes and novel research software to enable the kind of citizen science, the independent research on questions like the fact-checking study I just shared. One example is the civil servant software I used for that study, which was, I had a paper published about it in CHI 2018. With permission from online communities, the system collects data in real time, coordinates A/B testing of a policy idea, and manages community research ethics without having to ask the company for permission. Furthermore, as we support communities to validate our findings by openly publishing all results with our data, and as multiple communities ask similar questions, people who have governance decisions to make can discover where there are general effects and which interventions just work under some circumstances. In its first 3 years, the civil servant software was actually used for over a dozen field studies across Reddit and Wikipedia, with a pilot on Twitter underway. Now, today I talked about CatLab's work to test ideas about creating change in our social lives. We've also created novel systems for volunteer-based tests and audits of technologies and corporate policies, in addition to the civil servant software. And thanks to some recent grants from the Templeton World Charity Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, we're spending the next 3 years further developing our research systems to be more widely usable by scientific collaborators. So if you're excited about this vision and want to be CatLab's new deputy director or our research manager, I encourage you to check out our website and apply. So far, I've talked a lot about science and knowledge. Now, while researchers often value knowledge for its own sake, how can this knowledge inform governance? At CatLab, our findings have been used by communities as they make decisions. They've also influenced how tech companies design products, and they've been cited in national policy debates in different countries. And our research has also been published in some leading scientific journals. But I want to step back and ask a deeper question. What do we want the relationship between knowledge and governance actually to be? In engineering and the social sciences, many researchers describe their work as use-inspired basic research, where researchers start by imagining pragmatic needs or collaborate with partners to make discoveries that advance theory and practice alike. Unlike Niels Bohr, who was concerned with atomic theory, or Thomas Edison, who wanted to create usable products, these researchers try to do both at the same time, much like we have with CatLab. And that's what many policy researchers aspire to, according to Carol Weiss. They define a problem, identify missing knowledge, acquire research, interpret it, and then guide policy decisions, with science as a very valuable byproduct. Powerful organizations grow their power through this, scientists grow knowledge, and everyone wins, right? Not always. It depends on who you mean by everyone. We now live in a world where corporations have amassed the world's most powerful social science research endeavors in human history, endeavors that the public has learned to deeply mistrust. In 2017, a New York Times Magazine article, for example, accused the ride-hailing company Uber of pulling its workers' psychological levers. The company hired hundreds of social scientists to generate substantial evidence, and according to the article, used that knowledge to influence drivers to act against their own self-interest to benefit the company. And according to a Pew survey, we've reached a point where only 28% of Americans say that they can trust tech companies to do what's right most of the time. So what can we as researchers do to ensure that our work advances the public interest at a time when the public mistrusts tech companies, often on the basis of what they've actually done? During the Second World War, the Austrian exile and philosopher Karl Popper wrote about the politics of social experiments. Now, while Popper is often imagined as an advocate of unfettered positivism, he had deep doubts about the role of science and policy, imagining two kinds of governance: open and closed societies. In closed societies, authoritarians govern and manipulate the public towards goals on the paternalistic principle that the learned should rule. People like, say, Cornell professors. But in open societies, the public is encouraged to evaluate and criticize government decisions so that bad or incompetent rulers can be prevented from doing too much damage. And in the open society and its enemies, Popper yearns for a way to reconcile the social sciences with democracy without resorting to what he saw as Nazi-style eugenics. So he talks about two kinds of social engineers and social technology. The utopian engineer ignores complaints and actually suppresses criticism. For them, the path from research to policy is direct because they're making the decisions. And I have to be honest here, most corporate research advances this kind of closed society that deflects criticism and works in secret. In contrast, Popper's piecemeal engineer tries to alleviate social ills through social research that informs a democratic process of deliberation and compromise. These researchers produce evidence that informs a deliberative process that involves the public and also holds power accountable for failures and harms. The thing to remember, as described by the Nobel Prize-winning political scientist Elinor Ostrom, is that research is part of a governance struggle in complex ecosystems where the interests of multiple parties conflict. Ostrom argued that effective governance is easier to achieve when multiple parties, including citizen groups, are able to monitor the environment and verify evidence as part of a co-evolutionary race with other actors, including corporations, governments, and other opposing groups. So how can we govern human and machine behavior? This is an urgent question. It's unclear whether human algorithm interaction is science or engineering, though I'm hopeful that some science is possible. And either way, we have an urgent need to monitor and intervene when these dynamics go wrong, so that we can steer them in beneficial directions. Doing so will require us to use considerable creativity to remake the tools of research, because we're still learning what questions to ask, and because we need to do this work in ways that work for democracy. It's my hope that policies governing human and machine behavior will become as boring and trusted as environmental monitoring, FDA protocols for clinical trials, or government standards for car safety. Policy problems are rarely solved, but they can be managed, and in the struggle of governance, we can reduce harm and maybe even improve society one step at a time with the help of people who care and with good evidence. So whether you're an advocate, a policymaker, a researcher, or an engineer, I invite you to work towards a world where digital power is guided by evidence and also accountable to the public. That open society that Popper and Ostrom wrote about. Cat Lab has been supporting communities to make that vision real. We're growing, and this is something that I hope you can do in your own work as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. We now have time for audience questions. You can send us your questions via the Q&A box in Zoom. Indy Gupta and I will moderate, and I will read aloud our first question from the audience. Okay, let me start my video. The first question is from Dylan Earlbeck. Many of the problems mentioned in this talk pertain to the role of a company in designing its algorithms. What role, if any, do academic institutions have in improving algorithmic governance? After all, many students will be future designers of these algorithms.
I think there are a few roles that universities already play, and then some roles that we can come to play. I think largely the historical role of academia in much of computer science has been to, as you say, train students who are then going to go into industry or to develop innovations that are taken up by industry. And I know there's a lot of hope for education initiatives that can train like ethical engineers to go into corporations. When thinking about that, I tend to find the work of the sociologist Susan Silby, who's written really thoughtfully about corporate culture and the sociology of governance and safety in large institutions, who takes the view that individuals are like an individual-centered approach to managing or governing social problems is really insufficient. Like we've had other industries in like the engineering of bridges, the safety of products, and the safety of a medical profession, where really systemic problems require systemic interventions. And I'm still trying to figure out how best to support and train students who are going to go into the tech industry, because they're headed into the least powerful positions. And I'm not sure that we should place our best hopes on the next generation of students for creating change, especially when we have so many other tools like policy and public pressure and activism. And I think that's where I see a hopeful role for science as well. In so many domains, universities actually have an important accountability role. At Cornell, I'm in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, where we actually have an FDA testing, set of FDA testing labs. So in order to ensure the safety of the food supply, we have regulations that require require food producers to get their food tested by labs. And one of Cornell's business models and services to the public is to provide that testing service. So I would love to see more institutions think creatively, yes, train students in the best way you can, and think systemically and institutionally about a role for the university in a world where we might have good reasons to mistrust a given product or technology that's coming from a company.
Our next question is from Amanda Kraus, who asks, since you're working with industry researchers, can you recommend strategies for bringing in the questions you've raised and information you've mentioned into an industry-centric workflow?
Yeah, I at one point in my previous career, I was the research liaison for a small tech startup and supported us to collaborate with researchers. My experience then and since then has been that uncomfortable questions that matter to society on corporate failures are very difficult to build collaborations around. I've had a number of attempts at collaborations with companies who were very, for example, in the last few years, Twitter was very excited to do some online harassment research with me and some collaborators on preventing harassment. And they created a lot of publicity around the fact that they were doing that work with us. And unfortunately, they didn't follow through. And Carol Weiss talks about how one of the purposes of research is to deflect criticism. If organizations under pressure can say they're working with researchers on an issue, that allows them to delay, and it allows them to gain reputational benefits without any substantial change. And so while I know that collaborations with corporations on many scientific topics are valuable and important, I have almost exclusively now shifted my work to industry independent efforts. And I found that there are very interesting and meaningful methodological challenges, as well as a great number of opportunities to ask questions that really matter to people that corporations would never entertain if you free yourself of having to seek their approval. Sorry, I can't offer the magic wand to make those things work perfectly.
And you have a question from Ali Zaidi. He asks, doesn't the success of companies that are known to distribute false information go against the idea that capitalism will naturally regulate?
I think, at this point, I'm not a like political economist, but I think at this point, even the most pro-capitalism societies have acknowledged that unregulated capitalism is unworkable, right? And we've seen in other industries and part of human life that regulation is an important way to ensure that a sector serves the common good, or at least a way to minimize harm. I've talked about the food supply. Unregulated capitalism was making people sick and putting opium in the food to get people addicted to products. It was terrible, right? Until we came up with the regulations and the science to more effectively manage the food supply, to the point that we hardly think about it in countries like the United States. And one thing I found as an inspiration is actually the story of citizen groups who organized on advocacy and science to create that regulatory ecosystem. For example, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the magazine Good Housekeeping created a food testing lab where people subscribed and sent resources to a lab that could then test food products and inform the Good Housekeeping members of the safety of various mass-produced foods. And then in the early 20th century, when the US passed its laws creating the Food and Drug Administration, they actually hired the Good Housekeeping lab team to start the FDA's scientific research. So I think there's, even though there, I think, is an essential role for regulation, and we're all trying to figure out what it will look like, we don't have to wait. In fact, the more we can do to get started now, the better off society will be as we have more and more of these regulation debates.
The next question is from Carla Sanabria Villas, who asks, can the General Data Protection Regulation, also known as GDPR, make a difference in how companies manage algorithms by protecting consumer data?
That's a fascinating question, and I wish I knew enough about the GDPR to offer a clear answer to that. I will say that I know under the GDPR and also the California Consumer Protection Act, there are some rights that people gain around having being required that if they request their data and the data held by a company about them, or they request an explanation of certain algorithmic decisions, they can get something back from companies. And I think we're starting to see a number of initiatives. Consumer Reports here in the US has done a fascinating project that I was an advisor to, where they started organizing people to request their data as part of a broader move to expand accountability over how companies are collecting and using their data. And I'm hopeful that as we have more laws that give people access to their own information, we'll have more avenues opened for this kind of accountability research.
The next question is from Ji Hong Kai. They ask, because of the biased nature of the recommendation algorithm, are there concerns on aggravation of inequality and promotion of disunity? If yes, what are some plausible ways that we as internet users can judge what we consume from the media?
I love that question, especially because I first started asking these questions in respect to media attention issues. I was, and still am, concerned by inequalities in what news institutions choose to pay attention to in the world, how they portray particularly marginalized groups, and the way that HR and I guess employment discrimination combines with prejudices by audiences and financial inequalities in our world to mean that many marginalized groups are othered and very disrespectfully portrayed in the media. And that's something that started long before long before we had the internet version of it. So I spent a fair amount of time studying that in print, in online media, and then looking at how individual human behavior and our choices about who to have as friends, who to listen to and follow, amplified those inequalities rather than creating the world of human understanding, I think, that many of the internet's creators believed they were putting into place. And all of those things, right, get interpreted and amplified by algorithms that, unless they're designed very carefully, can just give us more of the same. I think there's a very rich conversation among the recommender system designers about how to resolve those issues as designers, where the angle I take on this, because I start with the people affected by those issues, is to ask, what can you do if you don't control the code or the underlying data or system in a very, any significant way? And the thing that gives me hope from this study with World News is that we can actually influence these things to behave differently if we work together, even if there's an intransigent entity that doesn't want to pay attention to the issue or create change. And I have a number of other studies that are in progress. One is in prep right now that looks at actually kind of an early warning, an automated countermeasure to recommender systems that create conflict and harassment. And we just finished a field experiment with a large online community looking at that issue. And we have some conversations ongoing with communities of color online who often find themselves in platforms like Reddit and elsewhere that are dominated by people who are dominant culture and who might not care or understand their values, goals, or needs. And so those are two areas where we're asking that question. And I think there needs to be so much more, definitely work in the computer science end, but also so much more work that takes the standpoint of affected communities and looks for solutions in those circumstances.
So we are 2 minutes from the top of the hour. So maybe we'll go one or maybe two more questions. Let me ask the next one. This is from Rick Barber, who asks, or who says, bottom-up grassroots action embodied by different forms of digital protest can also play a key role in striking a better bargain between people and large online platforms. The question he asks is, does the framing of governance feel top-down and potentially run the risk of missing out on opportunities for individuals and groups to contest platform and algorithmic practices via direct action?
I love that you pointed that out. We do have some pretty amazing examples of collective action forcing companies to at least say they're going to do things differently. In a 2016 paper, I wrote about a strike by moderators on Reddit that attempted to force the company to change its policies around harassment and offer better support. I think what I'd say is that we need all of the tools in the tool set. Each of us has a positionality in terms of power. There are contexts in which we are very powerful and contexts in which we have relatively low power. And what I would say is that many of us actually do have substantial influence in our communities and our contexts. We might not all be moderators of a 25 million person discussion community, but if you've ever edited Wikipedia, if you've ever been part of a group text, if you've ever had a conversation on social media, you have access to the capacity to spot problems, to intervene, and exercise your influence to create a change. And I think acknowledging that, using that, and maybe even contributing to discoveries about how we can all use that power more effectively is an important tool. in the wider set that we have, even as we work towards like more systemic and structural change. And I think that's the lesson I've taken from the history of food safety, people who just wanted their families to be healthy. The lesson I've taken from citizen science and consumer protection. You want to know that the furniture you purchase isn't going to be dangerous to your infant child. And in the environment, you care about your local stream, and you have some power there. And you can also work together as part of a larger movement to create change at a systemic level. And I think each of us can be asking what tool is the best to use at the different levels of power and engagement we have at our disposal.
I'm gonna squeeze in one last question. There are many more. Apologies for not getting to all of them. This one is by Eric Shee and asks, are there any other organizations, companies that do a good job in human machine governance?
Yeah, so as someone who does like industry independent research, when I make statements about a company's performance on something, I usually restrict myself to claims that I can point to direct evidence on. So that's not something I can really comment on. But what I can say is that the first step is to invest in the capacity to know. It's for too long, over and over, we hear tech company leaders say, we couldn't know, we were caught off guard. And the reality is that they have tremendous internal research capacities. And that means that either they're not investing using their staff to answer the questions that matter most to the public, or they're not making that evidence public. And so if the first step is to invest in the knowledge you need to do that governance well, the second step is to be transparent and open to the public about the research that you're doing. And I think at this stage, there are very few organizations that have even taken those baby steps. Like we live in a time when, a generation of people who've been hired into tech companies to do work on research and accountability and ethics, people like Timnit Gebru and others have been fired because they were trying to do the kind of work that I've just described. And so I think the next few years are going to be, unfortunately, a struggle just for this kind of work to exist, let alone serve the public good in the way that we urgently need it to do. I will point to a number of organizations who I think are doing great work, who I admire from the outside of industry. I'm a great admirer of the Markup, of the Consumer Reports Digital Labs, the Algorithmic Justice League, and Joy Buolamwini's work, initiatives like Our Data Bodies, and I'm sure I'm missing a number of others. We have a small and growing number of initiatives that are a few years old. We're starting to get off the ground, that are trying to imagine what kind of industry independent research this ecosystem needs and figure out how to actually deliver that. And so I'm excited and hopeful for the future, even at a time when industry is really struggling to figure out the right model and approach for doing similar things from the inside.
Nathan, thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk and for taking the time to meet with us today. And we also want to take a moment to thank our production team and invite them to turn on their video one more time. And none of this would be possible without the back-end work of Mitchell Oliver, Jingyi Gu, Vinay Koshi, Gabe Malo, Jorge Rojas, Adrian Wong, and our ASL translators from UIUC's Dres office. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. A recording of this talk, as well as the links shared in our chat today, will be posted to our website. Join us again for our next event with Ranveer Chandra on empowering farmers with affordable digital agriculture solutions on March 31st. We hope to see you all there.